Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. A recently published book raises a critical question. Have successive governments and prime ministers of India since 1947 led down the country and betrayed the people? The answer, it seems, is a resounding yes. Here is the book. It's called India is Broken, A People Betrayed 1947 to Today. And its author is a former economist with the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, and now presently a visiting professor at Princeton University, Ashoka Mody. Mr. Mody, as I said in that introduction, your book is called India is Broken, A People Betrayed 1947 to Today. Am I right in saying that that clearly suggests that over the last 75 years, instead of developing and progressing, India has failed, its potential has not been realized, and it's ended up like a broken toy? And all of this has happened because successive governments and prime ministers have let down the people and betrayed the country. Would that be correct?
Yes, that is correct. That is what I'm saying. As you noted, I've told the story through the eyes and words of successive prime ministers. But I have a message that I'm trying to convey through these stories. And the key question I started with is that if I look at the experience since the Industrial Revolution, 350 years, every successful country has educated its children and brought its women into the workforce. There is no exception. I'm going to say this again. There is no exception to educating your children and bringing the women in the workforce. Bringing the women in the workforce gives them an opportunity to then rear better, more educated children. The historian Robin Jeffries once said, "An educated father educates his son, an educated mother educates her family." And that is a mechanism that has operated in the Western countries, which are now considered developed, in East Asia, and most recently in Bangladesh.
But your book points out that this signally did not happen in India.
It did not happen, and it has vast consequences, because it is this process, when it happens, it leads to productivity growth. That productivity growth allows the transition from agriculture to good urban jobs, a competitive economy that can play on the world markets as well as domestically.
So at the root of India's problems is the failure of successive governments, and I mean by that successive prime ministers who control those governments, to educate the people and to bring women in increasing numbers into the workforce.
That is the central argument. And just to elaborate one more step, therefore, even today, 75 years after independence, more than 40% of the population is in agriculture. There's an urban jobs crisis, and India, barring a few exceptions, is not competitive on world markets.
And every single prime minister of this country, from Jawaharlal Nehru in 47 through to Narendra Mody in 2023, share responsibility and blame for this failure.
Yes, and I will add one more thing over here. The reason for the failure, and I know we are going to discuss the reasons more elaborately, but I need to give you a blanket statement here, which is the reason for this failure cannot be sought only in the policies. The reason for this failure is a broader moral failure, which began early and slowly.
What is the moral failure?
I'm coming to that. It began early and slowly. It gathered pace and has become irreversible.
But what is the failure?
The failure is to learn how to operate in an environment where people trust each other and cooperate each other, because that is the essence of creating public goods. We have gradually...
And every single prime minister shares responsibility and blame for this failure.
As I said, it starts early and slowly, but begins to gather pace and at some point becomes irreversible.
But every prime minister is responsible and shares the blame.
Exactly. That's why I say it starts early.
Let's then at this point talk specifically about two prime ministers, Jawaharlal Nehru and Narendra Mody.
Yes.
The first and the most recent. And I'll start with Jawaharlal Nehru. You write, Nehru had no aptitude for conducting the administration of the state. He worked tirelessly but devoted limitless attention to trivial matters. In contrast, you say of Sardar Patel that he was a man of action, and you add, if Patel had become India's prime minister, India would have taken a very different shape. I get the clear feeling that you believe Nehru was the wrong man to be the first prime minister of India.
Look, Nehru was a man of high idealism. Nehru is a man I respect. Nehru believed in the ideals of equality, secularism, and of shared progress.
But
Nehru's ability to translate his ideals into practice was where he fell short.
And this is a quality that was needed in the first prime minister, perhaps above any other.
This was an essential quality in any prime minister.
He didn't have it, and therefore he was the wrong man to be the first prime minister.
Look, he was a very beloved figure.
But what about the fact that he lacked the capacity, the quality, the talent to translate ideals into actual effective policy? Does that mean that he was the wrong man?
You can call him the wrong man, Karan. The problem with calling him the wrong man is that we then have a view on what the alternative was.
Well, you clearly suggest that the alternative was Sardar Patel. You call him a man of action, and you say, and I'm quoting you, if Patel had become India's prime minister, India would have taken a very different shape.
Okay, so I've been very careful there. I've said very different shape. I've not necessarily said a better shape. If you're going to make a direct comparison with Nehru and Patel, let us first acknowledge...
Let's not get lost into Nehru and Patel. I'm simply asking this question. Was Nehru the right man to be the first prime minister?
I am going to have to punt on that, because I am not... The only way I can answer that is to say that there was a clear counterfactual.
Let's see if the answer to that question, which you're reluctant to give me at the moment, emerges from the rest of our discussion. Because I wanted this point to go into how you analyze the way Nehru responded to the challenge of developing India. Because your belief that Nehru let down the country and betrayed the people emerges from your criticism of the way he responded to those challenges.
Correct.
Now you write,
Correct.
India required a development strategy closely aligned to that of Japan after the Meiji Restoration of 1868.
Correct.
You call it the best economic model for India. Briefly, why do you think India in 1947 should have emulated what Japan did in 1868?
Japan was the country that had most recently moved its people from agriculture to cities and industry.
And India needed to do the same.
India clearly needed to do the same. There was a clear understanding that India needed to do the same. The first plan said so. Second, Japan invested hugely in primary education from the get-go. The first Japanese ambassador to the United States in 1870 or thereabouts, His primary and only mission was to learn from the American education system. They brought back an expert from America to then guide them over the next 30 or 40 years.
This was in direct contrast to the Indian government's attitude to education.
100%. That is Nehru's fundamental failure. The lack of attention to human development.
Let's look at how Nehru actually sought to tackle the challenges in contrast to how Japan did it, which you think is what Nehru should have been following. To begin with, in terms of agriculture, which in 1947 employed 70% of the Indian workforce, Nehru's key thrust was land reforms. Although zamindari was abolished in the early 1950s, you write, and I'm quoting you, many Congress party leaders were large landlords. They undermined the reforms to protect themselves, their friends, and their supporters. Nehru had limited appetite to challenge the landed interests. Nehru lacked political resolve. What exactly was the problem? Was it a lack of commitment to land reform, or was he timid in the face of political opposition?
I think the commitment to land reform was there, at least judging by his statements.
So it was timidity?
It was timidity. It was clearly timidity. And I don't know, there were two possible sources of timidity. One was that he didn't like to confront people. And the second was that they were a vote bank. Popular though Nehruji was, and beloved though he was, he needed the vote banks. So he didn't want to upset that ship.
So you're saying here that when it comes to the land reforms, which are absolutely essential for the development of agriculture, Nehru knew what was required but lacked the resolve and the strength to do it. When he faced opposition, he sought popularity rather than firm action.
I'm not sure he sought popularity. I think that he was just instinctively uninclined to confrontation.
So he was timid.
Yes.
When resolve was needed,
Yes.
he lacked that strength.
Yes.
Now, on the industrial front, you write, India needed Japan-style rapid industrialization and urbanization to employ its exponentially growing population. This, you point out, called for labor-intensive manufacturing. Instead, Nehru put his focus on capital-intensive steel plants and heavy industry.
Yes.
Almost the opposite of what you think was needed. How terrible a mistake was that?
Look, so first of all, just to be clear, I'm not doing this in hindsight. There were contemporaries who were saying this. So a very well-known economist who's known as a monetary economist and an ultra-conservative person, Milton Friedman, was one of the people who came to advise for the second plan. And Friedman said that the second plan, with its emphasis on heavy industry and then a handloom sector for employment absorption, was inefficient in both ways. The heavy industry used labor inefficiently and the handloom used capital inefficiently.
But then you're suggesting something else, that there was contrary advice available to Nehru to correct what he was doing, but he chose to ignore it.
I'm saying that 100%. You see, as a historian, I have to be cautious that 75 saal ke baad, you are not second guessing the man.
So even at the time, Nehru was aware that people believed that his stress on heavy industry, on capital-intensive steel plants was wrong, that he should instead have been stressing labor-intensive manufacturing. This advice is available. He deliberately chose to ignore it.
And the package that came with the second plan, the folks at the Indian Statistical Institute associated with Mahal Obese, who were advising on the second plan, part of the package, and you see, one of the wonderful
But
things.
finish your thought.
One of the wonderful things about Nehru is he writes this down in his memoirs, in his essays.
But what was the advice that was in that plan which you've forgotten to tell me?
Human development.
Again, something he ignored.
Again, something he ignored.
Something he noted he was ignoring.
Something he noted he was ignoring. He acknowledged the ignoring of human development repeatedly.
So you can give Nehru perverse credit for actually acknowledging that he was ignoring the advice he should have followed.
Nehru understood everything. one of his earliest statements was, we need to create jobs. We need to stop these rubbish BA and MA degrees.
But he followed an industrial policy that actually was not good at creating the jobs that needed to be created, and he therefore failed to move people from agriculture to industry. One of the costs, and you point this out very carefully, one of the costs of Nehru's industrial policy, stressing not labor-intensive manufacturing but capital-intensive steel plants and heavy industry, is that the opportunity for growth that became available in the post-Second World War years was something India simply couldn't avail of. You write, and I'm quoting you, an extraordinary opportunity opened for India in the immediate post-war years. India had the possibility of making headway in the less sophisticated, labor-intensive product segments of the global markets. This is precisely what Japan had done. This is exactly what the Asian tigers did subsequently. Growth through exports. It's what Nehru should have been doing for India, but patently did not do.
It's a very interesting phase. The immediate post-war era was a boom period because there was a reconstruction boom going on around the world. World trade was growing on steroids. Japan was on its knees because of its war experience. And India was open. India was open to the possibility that it could export its way out. We had these industries in Ludhiana and
This was
Coimbatore.
a boom. Nehru's industrial policy, in short, India missed.
This was the first of the tragic misses that we had. We missed it again and again, as you have already hinted, and I do want to emphasize that we missed it multiple times.
So, an opportunity that could have taken India leapfrogging was missed because Nehru was following the wrong industrial policy.
Yes.
Your conclusion on how Nehru handled agriculture and industry seems to be the following sentence. India neglected two essential sources of economic development, agriculture and labor-intensive manufacturing. And for both those neglects, you squarely blame Nehru.
I have to, because he was the man who was steering that ship. And he chose a pathway around which he developed a rhetoric of socialism, and it came to be embodied as something very idealistic. But it was so far removed from socialism because, again, as Nehru acknowledged in his writings, socialism is equality of opportunity. And we had created an elitist model of growth right from the start. The Nehru heavy industrialization, or what he called the new temples of India strategy, was the original trickle-down strategy, that we create growth at the top, it'll filter down.
So the failure for India to transform its agriculture and therefore move people from the land to industry, and the failure of industry to be able to capitalize on the boom that was happening in the post-Second World years, both those failures lie squarely at Nehru's feet.
Yes.
Let's then come to education.
Yes.
We've talked about it tangentially up to now. Let's do it up front. You say rather than focus on mass primary education, Nehru set up elite IITs and IIMs. And you write, I'm quoting you, they added to Nehru's aura, but the benefits to India were limited. Explain to the audience, why were the benefits of those IITs and IIMs limited? We're very proud of the fact today that 13, 14, maybe 16, 17 of the world's top CEOs have come from precisely these institutions. That being the case, why was the benefit to India in the 60s and 70s limited?
So, Karan, I'm going to tell you that I'm not one of those CEOs, but both I and my wife are products of an IIT. So, I am a beneficiary of the Nehruvian policy. Let me just say that right up front. That said, look at the historical experience. I'm guided always by history. The American founding fathers in the late 18th century, early 19th century, the Japanese in the early 20th century, the Russians, every country, every single country, and I quote Tagore on this, that in its initial phase invests in schooling. It invests in primary and secondary education.
Simple things like 1, 2, 3, 4, A, B, C, D, learning to multiply, add and subtract. That schooling that would have given a foundation to the Indian people was something Nehru simply didn't provide.
It goes back to Adam Smith. Adam Smith is known as the world's greatest free marketeer. But Adam Smith said that even the most basic operations require the ability to read, write, and account. I remember this phrase, read, write, and account, because when I was doing my proofreading, I said he must have written count. And I have an electronic copy, so I searched it. He has repeated the phrase read, write, and account multiple times in The Great Wealth of Nations, which is considered a free marketing book.
And the consequence of Nehru failing to push mass primary education, you point out in your book, is twofold. First of all, low productivity because the workforce was uneducated.
Yes.
And secondly, you say, and this will be particularly hurtful to Nehru, hope that the institutes would harness science and technology in the service of Indians. That hope was never realistic because the institutes functioned as elitist islands of excellence. In other words, their impact may have been enormous on the people they were educating, but their impact on the rest of the country and the population was minimal.
And again, I'm going to insist that this was known contemporaneously. I'm not saying anything that I'm second guessing from today.
So once again, Nehru was aware
Yes.
that what he was pursuing as the education policy of the country was being challenged by others, and it wasn't considered contemporaneously to be the right policy.
Yes. So on the primary education side, the historical experience was just overwhelming. But on the IITs, a very eminent scientist, Meghnad Shah, said at the time that you create these elite institutions, you're going to eviscerate the existing university system. And the Allahabad University, Dinuma, is a prime example of that.
In fact, you very clearly say in your book that the blame for this skewed, and that's a euphemism, this skewed education policy was Nehru's temperament. You write, delivering quality education was a steep uphill climb, and Nehru's India never even tried to climb that hill. In other words, he lacked the grit, determination, and tenacity to educate the people.
It's the same analysis, Karan. It's the same analysis that you so correctly emphasize for agriculture, land reforms, education. Everywhere we come back to the same thing.
The more difficult the task, even if it was the most essential task that faced Nehru, the less he was willing to do it, or the less temperamentally he was capable of doing it.
Yes, the man had a good heart. So I call it.
But he didn't have iron resolve.
And that's the tragedy.
But in fact, the tragedy is even worse. It's not just that he lacked the tenacity, the grit and the determination, the iron resolve as I called it. He also failed hugely to put sufficient resources behind educating the Indian people. Again, I'm quoting you, India in the Nehru years has spent less than 2% of GDP on education, rather than the 4-5% of GDP recommended by Indian experts, presumably at that time.
Yeah, so the exact study which said 4 to 5 or 6% comes a little after Nehru. So, but I think the general idea that we needed to spend vastly more
Was known at the time.
There's no question about it.
And he didn't do it.
And he did not do it.
Just as Nehru...
on that he in fact said, he was inaugurating a women's college, and he said, look, I know that we need more basic education, but what can I do? We have other priorities, we have to do other things. So he always traded off.
But this is the bizarre thing. As you point out, all countries, you quoted the United States, you quoted Russia, you quoted Japan, made educating their people the highest priority. Nehru was aware, but actually chose to give preference to other priorities instead.
This is the triple tragedy. The history was known. He was a historian himself of considerable repute.
And there was Tagore, as you quote in your book, loudly advocating the need to educate people as the first priority.
And he heard Tagore.
And yet ignored him.
He acknowledged Tagore's...
But ignored him.
But ignored him.
Now, just as Nehru ignored education, he also seems to have ignored the health of the people of this country. You write, and I'm quoting you, neglect of human development did the greatest long-term damage. And then you add, that neglect is shocking.
Yeah, so I think that exact phrase of the shocking may be me citing somebody, but it is something I endorse. In other words, I would accept that as my statement.
So Nehru, for all his good intentions, left the Indian people uneducated and left their health unprotected. In fact, he left them unhealthy.
Yeah, he left them vastly uneducated. I mean, he didn't. There were more schools were built. There was more literacy and so on. So it was not like it was zero, but it
vastly uneducated.
Yeah, it needed to be gobs more.
And he left the health unprotected.
And the health too. Yes, absolutely.
In a sense, this seems to be your conclusion of the Nehru years. Again, I'm quoting you. Through the 17-year Nehru era, 60% or more of the Indian population remained in severe poverty.
Yes.
For this large fraction of Indians, the country made no progress. In other words, over 17 years of his rule, for 60% of the people, the country made no progress. These are the people Nehru betrayed.
Yes. I can only say yes to that. I mean, that is my conclusion.
And this is what you say about Nehru's legacy. His legacy was anemic material progress, denial of social justice, and a widening arc of moral degeneration.
Yes.
Now here let me quarrel with you a little. There's no doubt that from what you've said about Nehru's industrial policy, agricultural policy, his failure to promote primary mass education, his inability to protect the health of the Indian people, what you say about Nehru's legacy is absolutely correct. But on the other hand, if you look at the fact that he was the Prime Minister who established democracy, and despite the emergency, we continue to be a democracy. Despite Mr. Mody, we continue to be a democracy. He was the Prime Minister who encouraged freedom of the press. He was the Prime Minister who encouraged criticism not just of his government, but of himself.
Yes.
And finally, his non-alignment gave India a status in the 50s and early 60s way beyond what the actual merits of the country deserve. If you look at all of that, then surely your assessment of his legacy is a little one-sided.
Fair enough. Now, I think you raise a very important question. So just as I have departed from the convention of using GDP growth as a measure of human welfare and focused instead on the livability index that you have talked about, on democracy, I 100% agree that Nehru's idealism was right, in the right place, and that he maintained the etiquette for keeping the institutions of democracy in place. He had a great deference to the institutions. But we need to understand for a moment what is the meaning of the word democracy. What is a representative democracy? There are the people who vote for parties who then implement the aspirations of the people. If the aspirations of the people are not met, this is not me, this is James Madison, one of the original founding fathers of modern democracy. He says that betrays the people. The phrase I use is not that democracy doesn't work, but that democracy betrayed the people.
And didn't give them the life, the amenities, the education, the jobs that they not just deserved, but badly needed.
Yes, and so I have been careful. I'm not saying that democracy was not there. It was there in its form, but it was not there in its function.
Let me put it like this. You give credit to Nehru for having established democracy, nurtured democracy, established freedom of the press, encouraged criticism, and given India a certain international standing which was way beyond what the actual merit of the situation deserved. But, and the but is a huge but, Nehru let the country down in terms of economic development. He let the country down in terms of creating a situation where people from the land would move to industry. He failed to educate them. He failed to protect their health. So we had democracy in the abstract in terms of freedom to speak, criticize, institutions were secure. But the life that people wanted in terms of jobs, in terms of health, in terms of education, that was not delivered.
Yes, I'm going to add one thing though. You see, why write a history? Why not just write about contemporary India? Writing a history is because what happens earlier has a bearing later.
And so what Nehru failed to do conditioned the way India continued thereafter.
And one of the key points in your democracy theme, which conditioned the future, was what I call the widening arc of moral degeneration.
And that, as you say, began with Nehru.
The Congress Party functionaries below the most idealistic top level were already a bunch of crooks. And that is again a contemporary view. The Time magazine called them black marketeers
and basically you're saying Nehru failed to check and correct that.
Nehru completely failed to check and correct that. 1964 Santanam Committee report is already talking about corruption in the judiciary.
Okay, let's leave Nehru there. As you say, what Nehru failed to do in terms of industry, agriculture, education and health, and therefore to create sufficient employment for India's exponentially growing population, laid the foundation for the failures that followed thereafter.
And the moral degeneration.
In other words, Nehru left behind a legacy that in the hands of his successors, in a way became only steadily worse. Let's jump now to the second Prime Minister I want to talk about, Narendra Mody. In your book, you attack many aspects of what is called the Gujarat Model, and the first is the belief that it's promoted entrepreneurship. I'm going to quote you, and this time I'm going to quote you extensively. The Gujarat Model was marauding development on steroids. For businesses, it was bonanza time. They received virtually free land, large loans at nearly zero interest rates, generous tax breaks, and no fuss environmental clearances. The taxpayer bore the cost. Mody was not promoting entrepreneurship, he was subsidizing favorite industrialists who created virtually no jobs. So far from this belief that the Gujarat model promotes entrepreneurship, it was creating no jobs, it was giving tax benefits and other bonanzas to rich industrialists.
Have I said anything controversial? I mean, those are the facts. I mean, so just to go back for a minute over here, this Gujarat model of development actually emerges some years before it became known as the Gujarat model of development. It emerges in the UPA period. One of Nehru's legacies is this word socialism. Everyone loves to hate the word socialism and says we need more market-oriented economy. But the problem is that if you don't have a moral foundation, then the capitalism gets hijacked.
It becomes crony capitalism.
Call it crony capitalism. I just call it a vast oligarchic system which not only distorts the market, but distorts the democratic process.
And that's what you're saying about the Gujarat model, that it facilitated crony capitalism, it facilitated an oligarchic system, to use your precise words, it virtually created no jobs. The belief that he was promoting entrepreneurship was actually not just an illusion, it was a falsehood.
Yes, there is no question about it. I mean, if you look at the origins of the Gujarat model, it starts almost as a lark. There is no entity known as the Gujarat model. There's the Gujarat riots in 2002. There is the heavy pushback by Indian industry against Narendra Modi, led by Rahul Bajaj. And Narendra Modi scratches his head and says, I need to do something about it. And he and his buddies invent this phrase, Gujarat Model of Development.
But it actually only helps rich industrialists. It provides them opportunities and clearances. It makes profits for them. It doesn't provide jobs for people.
It's, in a very paradoxical way, this is the marketized oligarchic version of Nehruvian heavy industry.
In this context, you cite the example of Adani, Gautam Adani, whose turnover between 2000 and 2013, you say, increased 14-fold. Again, I'm going to quote you extensively. Gautam Adani embodied the Gujarat model. The Gujarat government sold Adani land at rates that were far below the market price. He received highly underpriced natural gas from a government-owned company and paid a much lower than contractually stipulated penalty for delays in supplying electric power to the state's grid. His projects caused irreparable damage to waterways and the livelihood of fishermen, and when he seized community pasture lands, he destroyed valuable mangroves. His capital-intensive projects created only a limited number of jobs, and these were mainly for skilled workers. What you're saying is that the success and growth of Adani did not lead to the success and growth of India.
So this is why I steer away from using GDP growth as a measure of human welfare. So all those people who celebrate the Gujarat model look at Gujarat's GDP growth. So if you put up a petrochemical plant, you're going to get GDP. But how many jobs are you going to get? What is the investment in education? I always keep coming back to what is the lived reality of people.
This is why I say the success and growth of Adani did not lead in any commensurate sense to the success and growth of India.
No, it did not. It was not designed to.
In fact, if I'm correct, you go one step further. The success and growth of Adani quite often happened at the cost of the success and growth of India, because you talk about the damage to waterways, the damage to the livelihood of fishermen. He seized community pasture lands, but he ended up destroying mangroves. His capital-intensive projects created only a limited number of jobs. His success and growth often happened at the cost of the Indian environment, of fishermen's livelihoods, of mangroves.
The damage to the environment is where my phrase marauding capital comes in. It is marauding in two senses. It is taking away resources from immediate needs for human capital development, and much worse, it is taking away from future generations. We are eating into the capital of our children.
This is why I say Adani's success and growth happened at the cost of India.
Yes, at the cost of our children.
Our future then.
I don't want to use an abstract word like India.
But our children is our future.
Yes.
You make one more point about the Gujarat model. You say, and again I'm quoting you, since the state's budget prioritized giveaways for big businesses, expenditure on education, health and other welfare services suffered. And as you point out, in terms of human development performance, and that includes things like life expectancy and female literacy, Gujarat is, and again I'm quoting you, not just middling, but downright bad.
Yeah, so the phrase is used in the following sense. It is middling if you look at the rankings, but it is bad in relation to the fact that this was considered one of the most dynamic states. Remember, Gujarat comes with huge historical advantages. You have Surat over there, which is one of the great port cities of the world. So it's not like Gujarat is starting on an empty slate. Surat has a vast entrepreneurial community, and it's one of the original places for the Indian textile industry.
And therefore, this is a state where you had expected life expectancy and female literacy to be considerably higher than it was.
And that is the sense in which I say it is bad.
And that is because the state's budget prioritized giveaways to big business. It didn't prioritize expenditure on education, health, or other welfare services.
Yes.
The priorities inherent in the Gujarat model were the wrong ones.
Yes, and again, the way you state it is very elegant. But remember, you said pretty much the same thing about Nehruji when we were talking about Nehru.
And now the same thing is being said about Narendra Modi and the Gujarat model.
Except that now we have the added layering of the vast destruction happening to the environment.
When Modi became Prime Minister in 2014, he promised to extend the Gujarat model nationwide. And again, I'm going to quote you. The Gujarat model and Modi were singularly unsuited to tackle India's needs. The result? GDP growth slowed, employment levels fell, poverty and precarity very likely increased, and human development advanced barely, if at all. So, just like Nehru, Modi too has let down and betrayed the people.
So, again, go back to my original statement. What is the process of development? Education, more women in the workforce, that increases
And better
productivity
health. And better health.
and better health. Let's stipulate education. I'm using a shorthand for education, health, and more.
It didn't happen under Nehru, it's not happening under Modi either.
Yeah, the state of our education system today is very tragic. Sometime in the late 90s, early 2000s, we enrolled all the children in primary school. But then the quality of education is so sad that kids in 5th grade cannot do 2nd grade math and so on. The result is that they drop out of school.
And what you're pointing out is that Modi is repeating the same mistakes Nehru made in the 40s, 50s, and early 60s.
Yeah, so Nehru called it the temples of New India. But that same headline grabbing policy style continues to this day. So, you have bullet trains and smart cities and all that wonderful stuff. But yeah.
Neither under Nehru nor under Modi has development reached people who need it. The jobs they want aren't there. The education they require isn't available. The health that needs to be protected, not enough is being done about it. Although Mr. Modi does and has instituted the health insurance scheme, but I imagine your position is that it hasn't gone anywhere near far enough.
Look, there are lots of very desirable policies that have been implemented.
But
they are slivers in a large package. The point of writing this book is to say health is not one thing. Education is not one thing. It all has to come in a package. Nutrition, livable cities, clean air.
And that package is missing under Modi as it was missing under Nehru.
And the only thing I would add to that is that the package, particularly in terms of environmental damage, has accelerated.
One of the most telling illustrations of how Modi has betrayed the Indian people is when you look at what has become of his election time promise. I believe it was made in 2014 that he would create 2 crore jobs a year each year. You write, and I'm quoting you, as against the promise of millions of new jobs under Modi, the Indian economy employed fewer people. Yes, fewer people in 2018 than 2012. Far from increasing jobs, they've shrunk under Modi.
Okay, so this statement that I will create 2 crore more jobs every year, I have not been able to trace it. The BJP manifesto in 2014 did say that. And the Narendra Modi cheerleaders like Gurcharan Das, etc., said that. So there was a presumption.
Let me just put out, if the BJP manifesto in 2014 said that,
yes,
2 crore jobs a year.
It didn't say 2 crores, but it did say vast number of jobs.
I believe that in fact this is something Mr. Modi said at the hustings, but again, on which date and in which particular place, I can't tell you because I don't have it at hand. But it's a well-repeated statement,
yes,
often quoted by the opposition against Mr. Modi,
yes,
which Mr. Modi has never refuted and denied, that he offered to and promised to create 2 crore jobs a year. The important point is that far from creating those 2 crore a year, after 8 years we should have therefore had 16 crore new jobs. You're saying jobs in 2018 were fewer than in 2012.
Yes, that is a completely accurate statement based on the National Sample
And
Survey.
therefore, I'm saying this is one of the most telling examples of how Modi has betrayed the country.
This is not just a telling example. This is the great Indian tragedy, that a country that is growing where the population is growing at this rapid rate, where something of the order of 7 to 10 million people are joining the workforce every year. We are not keeping pace with that. We are so far behind that we have, I don't know why there is no social explosion over here, but we are certainly headed in that direction.
We're coming to the end of this interview. I want to pull back from the two prime ministers we've discussed, Nehru and Modi, and put a couple of general questions to you. After 75 years of betrayal, after 75 years of failure to realize the country's potential, does India still have the capacity to develop and grow and become the world power it wants to be, or is that dream now beyond attainment?
Look, one never is able to time a book like this. It started many years ago. It comes at a moment when there is this hype cycle going on. So everywhere I go, I hear this is India's moment. And the one example that is always given to me is that we've got this wonderful payment system, this UPI. And I say, be serious, guys. I mean, how does the payment system help me increase the participation of women in the workforce? How does it reduce the violence against women in urban areas? How does it educate my children? How does it prevent Joshimath from sinking?
So then come back to my question. After 75 years of betrayal, after 75 years of failing to realize its potential, do we have the capacity to become the world power we want to be, or is that dream beyond attainment?
I think it is a complete hype.
When you say it's a complete hype, is the dream beyond attainment?
The dream is beyond attainment if we continue the current course.
You mean to say that even after 75 years of following the wrong course, if we change, we can achieve that dream?
But that change has to be not just a superficial change. That has to come from the inside. This is
I'll tell you why I asked that question, because I think virtually right at the end of your book, you write the following sentences. India started with hope. Can India still deliver on that hope? Or is it too late to repair the country's broken economy and democracy? You leave that question unanswered. I'm actually now trying to force you to answer it. Is that dream, is that hope realizable? Or is it gone too long and too far, and therefore is the hope gone?
I would say that hope has faded enormously, and I think all those who believe that hope still exists have the onus on them to more realistically assess what is needed, because it's not, the UPI is not going to cut it.
It all depends on whether the country changes course dramatically.
Yes.
And that means an almost U-turn in its agricultural, industrial, education and health policies.
Yes.
Suppose that doesn't happen, because at the moment there is no sign of it happening. Modi is simply repeating the mistakes that Nehru made 30, 40, 50 years ago. So if that dramatic change of course doesn't happen, what is the future staring India in the face? Even if our countrymen are reluctant to recognize and accept it, I want you to spell it out for them. If we don't change course, what is the future staring us in the face?
The sort of proximate future is vast problem of employment. Whether that morphs into social discontent and some kind of a social movement, I cannot predict. But remember, as you quite rightly point out, that in the last 10 years, and if you take the COVID period, it's actually negative job creation. In the next 10 years, by my calculations, to fully employ all working age Indians, we need 200 million jobs at the very least. Going from 0 or negative to 200 is a vast task. I think we need to understand the magnitude of that task.
And that means the magnitude of the change that's required to achieve that task.
Exactly.
But what you're saying is, if that change doesn't happen, we will be facing mass unemployment as a country, which could threaten huge levels of discontent.
Yes,
and perhaps social violence.
All of the above. There's no way to predict that. But
So in other words, if we don't change course dramatically, and I presume fairly quickly, it is a bleak, grim future that's staring us in the face.
yes.
Mr. Mody, on that very depressing note, thank you very much for this interview.
Thank you very much, Karan.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.